when I was 25 or so, I probably weighed about 138 pounds. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. I drank tremendous amount of alcohol. I was from northern Alberta, this rough little town up in northern Alberta called Fairview, and there were long winters there, and my friends were heavy drinkers, and most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 15 or 16, went off to work on the oil rigs, and it was a rough town, and we drank a lot. I started when I was 14, and and so I had a lot of bad habits, let's say, and things that were, and I wasn't in great shape physically, and I was also still intellectually obsessed by, as I am now, and so that would have been in 85. But I decided around then, about 85, 84, something like that, maybe a little earlier, that I was really going to try to get my act together, and so I started doing that. First of all, I quit smoking. Well, that took a long time because I eventually had to quit drinking too in order to quit smoking, and I started working out, started playing sports, which I'd never done. I was a small kid. I'd been skipped a grade, and I was small for my age, so sports were never, especially team sports, were never really a domain of expertise for me. Although I skied and went trapping with my dad, and went cross-country skiing and camping and all that. So, but when I went to graduate school, I started swimming. The first physical exercise routine I did, I enrolled in a swimsercise course, I think it was called. So it was me and this like really overweight kid, and like these 60-year-old women and men, they could out exercise me like mad. It was really embarrassing. Me and the overweight kid, we'd be just panting ourselves 3/4 to death at the end of the bloody workout, and these 60-year-old women who weren't in great shape were like chatting away as if nothing was going on at all in the pool. So that was quite embarrassing, and as was going to the weight room, because when I started I could barely bench press 75 pounds, and people used to keep coming over and helping me, which was the last thing I bloody well wanted, but certainly needed. And I got to the point where I could bench press 225 pounds. I think that was the best I did, and I gained about 30 pounds of muscle in a year and a half. So that was a good thing. So like I was kind of a wild man, and I'm a little bit manic in my temperament, and so I was kind of going every direction at the same time. So, and I don't regret that. I had a fine time when I was a kid, but I needed really to get disciplined, and I had to do it because I was working on these hard problems that that I've been discussing with all of you, and I've been working on them really obsessively since I was probably about 18, maybe even earlier than that. Got to the point around 25 when I was in graduate school trying to get my PhD, so doing all my research. Like I published 15 papers by the time I graduated with my PhD, which was I think by a fairly large measure the most papers that any graduate student at that time had ever published at McGill. I think that's right. It might have been twice as many, or maybe twice as many, maybe even 3 times as many. And at the same time I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was a terribly difficult thing to do, because I was writing about 3 hours a day doing that, and I couldn't do all that and continue with my misbehavior, my sort of what would you say, my hedonistic my massive hedonistic consumption of alcohol and all of that. I just couldn't keep it up, and also work seriously on the issues that were at hand. So I had to stop. That's a sacrifice. I had to stop messing about and straighten myself out. And I got married. Well, the woman who's my wife, Tammy, who I've known since she was 8 years old, she lived across the street from me in this little town called Fairview, and I was in love with her like the first time I saw her, which is quite the bloody thing. So that's worked out pretty well for me. But she came to live with me about the same time, and we decided jointly to get our act together, and we swore that we'd tell each other the truth, which I think she's actually done better than me. Like I don't think she's lied to me ever in our entire marriage, which is unbelievable, and it's been so useful because I can really tell her things and we can really talk. So I tell you, if you want to have a good relationship, man, you embed it in the truth, because if you don't embed it in the truth, you don't have a relationship. It's just lies. It's a tissue of lies, and it will dissolve in the chaos as soon as a crisis comes along. So the truth is a terrible thing, but not compared to falsehood. So
Any advice for students here?
Yeah, read great books.
Mm-hmm.
Really, man.
You've got this 4-year period that has been carved out of your lives by society. It's given you an identity, like a high-quality identity, and freedom at the same time. And you're not going to get that again in your life. You've got a respectable identity, university student, and complete freedom associated with that, or as near as you're ever going to get. And you've got these unbelievable libraries that are full of the writings of people who are intelligent and articulate beyond comprehension. And you know, and you can go there and you can learn all this. And you might think, well, why should you learn it? Well, you learn it to get a job, or you learn it to get good grades, or you learn it to get a degree, and that's all nonsense. It's nonsense. The reason that you come to university to be educated is because there is nothing more powerful than someone who is articulate and who can think and speak. It's power, and I mean power of the best sort. It's authority and influence and respectability and competence. And so you come to university to craft your highest skill, and your highest skill is to be found in articulated speech. And if you're a master at formulating your arguments, you win everything. And better than that, when you win everything, everyone around you wins too. Because to transform yourself into, let's consider your transformation to something approximating the logos, it means you shine a light on the whole world. Well, there's nothing more exciting to do than that. There's nothing better you can possibly do. And to think that you're coming to university to be, you know, trained to have a job, it's like, great, that's a hell of a lot better than being unemployed and covered with Cheeto dust while you're snacking away in front of your video game in the basement. But it's not a, and I don't have anything against video games, by the way, but but it's hardly a triumphant call to being in the world, and that's what university should be calling forth. It's like, God, you people, you know, I know what Harvard students are like. I taught here for 5 years. You people are spectacular. You're spectacular. You're all capable of being world beaters. You transform yourself into something that's articulated and sensible and grounded in history and knowledgeable and wise, man. You can do anything you want, and hopefully anything you want for good. Because if you have any sense, everything you want to do would be for the good, because there's nothing more compelling or meaningful or useful in combating the tragedy of life than to struggle with all your soul on behalf of the good. And the universities have forgotten that. It's why everyone's bailing out of the humanities, and they should. The humanities are corrupt. And they're corrupt because they're not telling students this. It's so bloody obvious. It's like, learn to think, learn to speak, learn to read. It makes you a superpower, an individual superpower. You have and I don't understand why that isn't just told to students. It's not that hard to understand, and everyone wants to hear it. It's like, really? I could do that? I could do that? It's like, yeah, really, you could do that. And the whole society around you has labored for really thousands of years to provide every single one of you with this spectacular opportunity that you have while you're undergraduates and graduate students here, man. Everyone's just praying that you would come here and manifest everything that you could manifest. And that's what you should be doing, instead of waving placards and complaining about how you're oppressed, for God's sake. You see these Yale students complaining about their oppression. It just leaves me aghast. It's like, well, we're against the ruling class. It's like, no, you're baby ruling class members. You're young. The only reason you're not rich is because you're young. You know, that's the best. Really, if you look at the 1% even, the dreaded 1%, you know, most of those people are old. Why? Well, when you progress through life, if you're reasonably successful, you trade in your promising youth for your wealthy old age, but you're still bloody old. Would you trade it? Would you trade your youth for that? Like, if you factor age out of the economic equation, things look a lot different. Well, of course older people have more money. If they have any sense, they've been collecting it for their whole life. Is that somehow unfair? It's not unfair unless you want to be poverty-stricken when you're 70, and you don't want to be poverty-stricken when you're 70. So I just don't understand what's happened to the universities. I can't believe that you're not told when you come the first day, look, man, you're here on a heroic mission. You're going to take your capacity to articulate yourself to levels that are undreamed of. You're going to come out of here unstoppable. You're going to be able to do anything you want. It's like, that's what you're here for. Instead, you're taught that well, you know, the world's a pretty oppressive place, and you're probably the bottom of the victim pile, and there's virtually nothing you can do about it except, you know, deconstruct the patriarchy. And it's so weak-kneed and so pathetic that universities should be embarrassed that that's what they're peddling to students. I'm embarrassed by it. You know, I've gone on public record telling parents, bloody well send your boys to trade school, because at least they'll learn something useful. And that's a terrible thing for someone like me to say, because I do believe that being articulated and educated in the highest possible manner there's nothing that's better for you and for society. And why have the universities forgotten this? Well, that's postmodern neo-Marxism for you, you know, and the philosophy of intense resentment and oppression and group identity, and God, it's just pathetic.
Dr. Peterson, I think a lot of students here would agree with you that one of the main purposes of education at college, particularly at Harvard, is to develop their sense of articulation, their ability to read, their ability to critically think. But then what comes after? Particularly at Harvard, there's a big discussion on what is a good life? What does it mean to use those skills that we get here, and then we graduate? What do we do from there?
Stop unnecessary suffering. That's what you do. You know, that's your calling. It's like you say, well, what do you do after you graduate? Well, if you graduate articulated and powerful, there will be people giving you so many opportunities you won't even be able to keep up with them. You know, and I've worked with very, very competent people in many different domains in my life, hyper-competent people. And I can tell you some very interesting things about hyper-competent people. The first thing is they are not selfish, and they're not greedy. And one of the great pleasures in their lives is to find people who have the capacity to also be hyper-competent and to open doors for them as rapidly as they can possibly be opened. They delight in that, because there's very few things that are more intrinsically meaningful if you're an accomplished person than to find young people who have the possibility of being accomplished and say, hey, look, here's an opportunity for you. It's like, go out there, man, kill it. And then they go out there and kill it, and you think, right on, man. Here's another opportunity. Why don't you go out there and nail that, too? And you think, no, they're all hoarding their wealth, and they're not going to share it with anyone. It's like, that's absolute, complete rubbish. And so you don't even have to worry about what you're going to do after you graduate from here if you turn yourself into half of what you could be, because people will be dying to offer you every opportunity that you can possibly make use of. So it's a moot point. The world is always desperately short of people who can think and speak. And you think, well, I won't be made use of. Well, first of all, you can't say that if you're at Harvard, for God's sake. I mean, people already figured out who you are. They've already figured it out. And they're offering you the world on a gold platter. They take it. It's yours. Take it. It's like, great, man. Put yourself together and deserve it. That would be great. And that's what everyone wants. It's what your parents want. It's also what you want. You know it. It's what you want. It's what women want from men. It's what men want from women. It's like for you to be who you could be. And the highest faculty of the human being is articulated speech. It's the divine faculty. And there is nothing more powerful than that. There's nothing that's even in the same league. And so if you don't have faith in that, then your priorities are misplaced. And I can't even understand why you wouldn't have faith in that being, say, Harvard students, because look where it's got you already. You know, you're already sitting on top of the world. So deserve it, make use of it, right? Go out there and fix things up. That's what you need to do. There's lots of things that need to be fixed up. And what you want to do is burden yourself with so much responsibility that you can barely stand. And then you'll get stronger trying to lift it up. And you won't be asking, what should I be doing with my life, or what's the meaning of life, or any of that. It'll be self-evident. It's self-evident. At minimum, you can say, there's more suffering in the world than there should be, and I could probably do something about that. And you can do something about that. So go do something about it. And then there'll be less suffering in the world. And then when you're 80, you can look back on your life and say, well, you know, there's less suffering in the world than there would have been had I known it existed. And you don't have to even have a sense of ultimate destiny or even any sort of theistic belief to regard that as a positive good. Like, I think it goes beyond the mere pragmatic utility of addressing the world's ills, because I think we do live in a world that has a transcendent reality as well as the reality that we can detect. But even independently of that, it doesn't matter. It's like, I mean, this is part of the reason I like people like Bill Gates is a great example, man. That guy he's after 5 major diseases at the same time. right? He's trying to wipe out polio. He's trying to wipe out malaria. Yeah, exactly. He's trying to wipe out malaria. It's like, well, what should you do with your life? Well, you know, take a look at Bill Gates and see if you could do something like that. That would be good. You know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things, and I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing. And we have no idea how fast we could multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, and like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough. But you go ahead and do it anyways, and then, of course, exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident. Because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing too is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe, and that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live. You have a real life, and it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least, over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1,000,000, and two persons away from 1,000,000,000. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. Now, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life, and they still suffer, yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. If you're hungry, it's not a deterministic drive. It's a subpersonality that has a goal, and then it has a bunch of action patterns that are going to work in reference to that goal. It has a bunch of perceptions that suit that goal, and it organizes your emotional responses around that goal. And so to think about it as a personality is it's a much more intelligent way to look at it. One other thing about Skinner's rats, you know, Skinner could get rats to do almost everything, and he would reward them with food. And so he had a simple rat model, but his rats were starved down to 75% of their normal body weight. So not only were they not social, gregarious rats like rats are, because they were isolated, they were genetically altered from wild rats, but they also weren't as complex as a real rat because they were starving. And so, but you know, a starving rat is a pretty good model of a rat, and a rat is a pretty good model of a person. But a lot of our models of simple behavioral learning were based on starving, isolated rats. So, anyways, how to think about motivation? We'll think about it from the hypothalamic perspective. So we could say one thing that motivation does is set goals. And we could say that emotions track progress towards goals. And I'm going to use that schema even though it's not exactly right. So you say, well, motivation determines where you're going to aim. So if you're hungry, you're going to aim at something to eat. And then that will organize your perceptions so that you zero out everything that isn't relevant to that task, which is almost everything. You concentrate on those few things that are going to facilitate your movement forward. When you encounter those things, that produces positive emotion as you move through the world towards your goal, and you see that things are laying themselves out that facilitate your movement forward. Those things cause positive emotion. And if you encounter anything that gets in the way, then that produces negative emotion, and it can be like threat, because you're not supposed to encounter something that gets in the way. It can be anger, so that you move it away. It can be frustration, disappointment, grief. Those would, if you had a response that serious to an obstacle, it would probably punish the little motivated frame right out of existence. You know, so you walk downstairs and, I don't know, the contracting company has set a wrecking ball through your kitchen. It's like, that's going to be disappointing. You're not going to keep eating the peanut butter sandwich in the rubble. That little frame is going to get punished out of existence, and some new goal is going to pop up in its stead. And you know, one of the things we're going to try to sort out is how do you decide when you've encountered an obstacle that's so big that you should just quit and go do something else, because that's not obvious, you know. And you can get into counterproductive persistence pretty easily. So we don't know how people solve that problem. It's a really complicated one. So anyways, we're going to work on that scenario. Your hypothalamus pops up micro goals that are directly relevant to biological survival. That produces a frame of reference. So it's not a goal, it's not a drive, and it's not a collection of behaviors. It's a little personality. And the personality has a viewpoint, it has thoughts that go along with it, it has perceptions, it has action tendencies, all of that. You can see this in addiction, most particularly. So one of the things that you find often with people who are alcoholic is they lie all the time. And that's because when they've built a little alcohol dependent personality inside of themselves, or a big one, maybe it's 90% of their personality, and one of the things that consists of is all the rationalizations that they've used over the years to justify their addiction to themselves and to other people. And so the addiction has a personality, you know. And so when the person is off, or maybe they're addicted to meth or something like that, where, you know, the addiction is more, it's more short-term powerful than I would say than an alcohol addiction. They'll say anything, and the words are just tools used to get towards the goal. And if they happen to be deceptive, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just practical tools to get towards the goal. And then when you get towards the goal and you take a nice shot of meth or something like that, you reinforce all those rationales that you used to get the drug, and then the next time you're even a better deceiver and liar. So, okay, so we're going to say motivations, one way of thinking about it is they set goals, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. They produce a whole framework of interpretation. And so we're going to think about that framework of interpretation. And then emotions emerge inside of that. So that's it. So the world is framed, motivation set goals. You could say the world has to be framed. So motivation sets that frame. Goals, emotions, perceptions, and actions. And then actions track progress. So positive emotion says you're moving forward properly towards your goal. And if you encounter something you don't expect, you stop. That's anxiety. It's like, oh, we're not where we thought we were. And so we don't know what to do. So we should stop because we don't know where we are or what we're doing. Stop, frozen. And then the more powerful negative emotions like pain, they might make you get out of there. So Emotions: forward, stop, reverse. That's your emotions within that motivated frame. So, and that's another example of how your mind is embedded in your body. Your emotions are like they're offshoots of action tendencies. That's the right way to think about it, because action is everything fundamentally. So what are some basic motivations? Most of these are regulated by the hypothalamus, by the way, and that tells you just how important a control system it is. The other thing that's useful to know about the hypothalamus is that it has projections going up from it that are like tree trunks, and inhibitory projections coming down that are like grapevines. So you can kind of control your hypothalamus as long as it's not on too much, but if it's on in any serious way, it's like it wins. So partly what you do to stop yourself from falling under the dominion of your hypothalamus is to never ever be anywhere where its action is necessary, right? You don't want to go into a biker bar because you might find yourself in a situation where panicked defensive aggression is immediately necessary. You probably don't want that. You don't want the panic, you don't want the terror, you don't want the frenzied fight, you don't want any of that. You don't want to have to run away in absolute panic. So you just don't go there. And a huge part of how we regulate our emotions is just by never going anywhere where we have to experience them. And so that has very little to do with internal inhibitory control and everything to do with staying where you belong. So, okay. So, basic motivations: hunger, thirst, pain. Pain is not regulated by the hypothalamus. That's a different circuit. Anger / aggression, thermoregulation, panic and escape, affiliation and care, sexual desire, exploration, play. And you can kind of break those in, into the classic Darwinian categories too, and say, well, there's a set of motivations that go along with self-maintenance. That'd be your survival. Ingestive and defensive. See, I've sort of coded them there. So the self-maintenance, there's an ingestive set of basic motivations that go with self-maintenance. You say that's hunger, thirst. There's a set of defensive motivations: pain, anger, thermoregulation, panic and escape. And then there's motivations that are associated with reproduction: affiliation, care, and sexual desire. And then I put exploration and play sort of outside of that. I would say because those two things serve both of these approximately equally.